In the dusty archives of ancient Mesopotamia, carved into clay tablets that have survived for thousands of years, there exists a document that should not be possible. The Sumerian King List, a chronicle of rulers who reigned before a catastrophic flood reshaped the world. But here is where it gets strange. According to this list, kings ruled for periods that defy everything we think we know about human history. Not decades, not centuries, but tens of thousands of years. And before the Great Flood, these reigns stretched back an impossible 432,000 years. 432,000 years. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. Mainstream archaeology will tell you that civilization as we know it began around 5,000 years ago in Sumer. That writing, agriculture, and complex societies emerged relatively recently in the grand timeline of human existence. But the Sumerians themselves, the people who supposedly invented civilization, are telling us something completely different. They are saying that organized society, kingship, and advanced culture existed for nearly 500,000 years before the flood that almost ended everything. Now, you might be thinking this is just mythology, ancient people exaggerating, creating origin stories that make their civilizations seem more impressive than they actually were. And that is exactly what establishment archaeology wants you to believe. But here is the problem. That number, 432,000, keeps showing up again and again in cultures that supposedly never had contact with each other, in mathematical systems that seem designed to preserve astronomical knowledge, in monuments that align with celestial events in ways that primitive people should not have been able to calculate. This is not about believing every ancient text at face value. This is about following evidence that makes trained archaeologists uncomfortable. Evidence that suggests human history is far older, far stranger, and far more sophisticated than the simplified narrative we have been taught. Let us start with something physical, something you can actually visit and touch with your own hands. In southeastern Turkey, there is a place called Göbekli Tepe. It was discovered in the 1990s, and it immediately shattered every timeline archaeologists had constructed about human development. This site dates back 11,600 years. To put that in perspective, it was already 6,000 years old when the pyramids of Egypt were built. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates agriculture, pottery, writing, and everything we associate with civilization. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe truly unsettling. It is not primitive. The site consists of massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in precise circles. These pillars are carved with intricate depictions of animals, abstract symbols, and geometric patterns. The level of organization, planning, and skill required to create this complex is staggering, and according to conventional history, it should not exist. The people who built this were supposedly hunter-gatherers, nomadic tribes who had not yet discovered farming, who lived in temporary shelters, who possessed only the most basic tools. So how did these primitive people quarry, transport, carve, and erect stones that would challenge modern construction crews? How did they coordinate the labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands of workers without written language or centralized authority? How did they design circular structures with astronomical alignments before they supposedly understood astronomy? The standard answer is that we have underestimated ancient people, that hunter-gatherers were more capable than we gave them credit for. And while there is truth to that, it does not explain everything, especially when we look closer at one particular pillar at Göbekli Tepe, Pillar 43. In 2017, researchers at the University of Edinburgh, led by Dr. Martin Sweatman, published a controversial analysis of the symbols carved on Pillar 43. What they found was extraordinary. The carvings appear to be a star map, not just random artistic representations of animals, but a sophisticated record of the night sky as it appeared around 10,950 before the Common Era. Even more remarkably, the symbols seem to document a specific astronomical event, a comet impact. This lines up perfectly with something scientists call the Younger Dryas Impact Event. Around 12,800 years ago, the Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. The impact triggered massive wildfires, tsunamis, and a sudden return to Ice Age conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. Woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats went extinct. Sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted and refroze in chaotic cycles. And according to geological evidence, this event would have been absolutely catastrophic for any human populations living at the time. Now think about what this means. The people at Göbekli Tepe were not just building impressive stone circles, they were recording cosmic catastrophes. They understood celestial mechanics well enough to track comet movements and predict impacts. They possessed knowledge that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. And then, for reasons we still do not fully understand, they deliberately buried the entire site. They filled in the circles with rubble and soil, preserving it like a time capsule, and walked away. Who does that? Who builds something so magnificent, so precisely aligned, so culturally significant, and then intentionally buries it? Unless they were trying to preserve knowledge. Unless they knew something worse was coming. Unless they were the survivors of an even older civilization trying to leave clues for whoever came next. And Göbekli Tepe is not alone. In Indonesia, there is a site called Gunung Padang. It sits on top of an extinct volcano and has been known to locals for centuries as a sacred place. But recent archaeological investigation has revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the surface structures, which are already thousands of years old, there are deeper layers, much deeper layers. Ground-penetrating radar and core samples suggest that the lowest levels of Gunung Padang could be 20,000 to 25,000 years old. If that dating is accurate, and it remains controversial, then we are talking about pyramid construction during the last ice age, a time when humans were supposedly living in caves and hunting with stone-tipped spears. The Indonesian government and some archaeologists have pushed back hard against these claims. They argue the dating methods are flawed, that the deeper structures are natural geological formations, that the researchers are seeing patterns that do not exist. But the radar data shows chambers. It shows organized stone arrangements. It shows evidence of human modification going down over 100 feet below the surface. Natural geological processes do not create perfectly aligned chambers and precisely cut stone blocks. So, we have a pattern emerging. We have the Sumerian King List talking about 432,000 years of kingship before the flood. We have Göbekli Tepe, an impossibly sophisticated complex built by people who should not have had the knowledge or organization to create it. We have evidence of comet impacts and global catastrophes preserved in stone carvings. We have sites like Gunung Padang suggesting pyramid-building cultures existed during the Ice Age, and we have deliberate burials, as if ancient people were trying to hide or preserve something from coming disasters. The question is not whether these sites exist. They do. You can visit them. The question is what they represent. Are they isolated anomalies, impressive but ultimately explainable within our current historical framework? Or are they fragments of something much larger? Evidence of civilizations that rose and fell long before our recorded history begins? Before we go further down this path, if you are finding this evidence as compelling as we do, consider subscribing to Tales Before Tesla. We dig into the mysteries of ancient history that conventional archaeology would rather ignore. Hit that notification bell so you do not miss future investigations, because what we are about to explore next gets even stranger. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. The 432,000-year number from the Sumerian King List is not unique to Mesopotamia. It shows up in Hindu texts. In the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious documents in existence, there are references to cosmic cycles lasting 432,000 years. In Babylonian records preserved by the priest Berosus, we find the same time span mentioned in connection with antediluvian kings. In Norse mythology, the warriors of Valhalla number 540 times 800, which equals 432,000. This is not coincidence. This is a number that ancient cultures across continents, across linguistic groups, across supposed barriers of time and geography, all decided was important enough to preserve in their most sacred texts. Why? What makes 432,000 special? The answer might lie in the stars, because this number has deep connections to astronomical cycles that ancient people should not have known about. But they did, and that knowledge terrifies mainstream archaeology, because it implies a level of scientific sophistication that existed long before civilization was supposed to have begun. That story continues. and the mathematics behind it reveal something even more extraordinary about what our ancestors knew and what they were trying to tell us across the millennia. The number 432,000 is not random. It is not mythology, it is mathematics. And when you understand what it represents, you start to realize that ancient civilizations were far more scientifically advanced than we have been led to believe. Let us break this down. 432,000 can be expressed as 60 times 60 times 120. That might not seem significant until you understand that the Sumerians used a sexagesimal counting system. Base 60, the same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We still use their mathematical framework today, thousands of years later, because it works so elegantly for dividing time and measuring celestial movements. But why would ancient people choose base 60? Because it is incredibly useful for astronomy. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes calculating planetary cycles, lunar phases, and stellar movements far easier than our modern base 10 system. The Sumerians did not stumble onto this accidentally. They were taught it, or they inherited it from someone who understood higher mathematics and celestial mechanics. Now here is where it gets fascinating. There is an astronomical phenomenon called the precession of the equinoxes. Imagine the Earth as a spinning top. As it spins, it also wobbles very slowly on its axis. This wobble takes approximately 25,920 years to complete one full cycle. During this cycle, the position of the stars in the night sky gradually shifts. The North Star has not always been Polaris, and it will not always be Polaris. Ancient astronomers noticed this incredibly slow movement and tracked it with precision that should not have been possible without telescopes and centuries of continuous observation. Here is the connection. If you divide 25,920 years by 60, you get 432 years per degree of precession. 432. That number again. Ancient cultures were encoding precessional knowledge into their mythology, their king lists, their sacred texts. They were preserving astronomical data in the only way they could guarantee it would survive catastrophes. Through stories and numbers repeated so often they became unforgettable. The Maya understood this too. Their long count calendar, which caused so much panic in 2012, operates on cycles called baktuns. Each baktun is 144,000 days. Multiply that by 3, and you get 432,000 days. The Maya were obsessed with tracking time, not just for agricultural purposes or religious festivals, but because they understood cosmic cycles. They knew that celestial events recur in predictable patterns, and those patterns could be calculated mathematically if you paid close enough attention over long enough periods. But tracking precession requires continuous observation spanning generations. You cannot notice the stars shifting positions within a single human lifetime. The movement is too subtle. You would need institutions dedicated to astronomical observation, records kept for centuries, knowledge passed down through professional classes of priests or scientists. You would need, in other words, civilization. Not the kind that lasts a few hundred years and collapses, but the kind that maintains stability and continuity for thousands of years, long enough to notice the stars slowly wheeling through their great cosmic dance. And evidence of that kind of astronomical sophistication exists in places that predate written history. In southern Egypt, near the Sudanese border, there is a site called Nabta Playa. It is essentially Africa's Stonehenge, a circle of massive stone slabs arranged to mark astronomical alignments. But Nabta Playa is older than Stonehenge, much older. It dates to approximately 7,000 years before the Common Era, 9,000 years ago. At that time, according to conventional history, the Sahara was not yet a desert. It was a green savanna with lakes and rivers, capable of supporting large populations, and someone living there possessed the knowledge and motivation to construct a calendar circle that tracked the summer solstice and possibly stellar alignments. They quarried stones weighing several tons, transported them significant distances, and erected them with precision. Why? What were they tracking? What was so important about marking the solstice that it justified such massive effort? The same question applies to Stonehenge itself. Built in stages between 3,000 and 2,000 years before the Common Era, This monument aligns perfectly with the summer and winter solstices. On the morning of the summer solstice, the sun rises directly over the heelstone and shines into the center of the circle. Thousands of years later, that alignment still works. The engineering precision required to create that effect is extraordinary. These were not primitive people randomly stacking rocks. They were scientists and engineers working with sophisticated understanding of geometry, astronomy, and construction techniques. In Ireland, there is a passage tomb called Newgrange. It predates both Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, dating back to around 3,200 years before the Common Era, 5,000 years old. The tomb is aligned so precisely that on the winter solstice, and only on the winter solstice, sunlight penetrates through a small opening above the entrance, travels down a 60-foot passage, and illuminates the inner chamber for exactly 17 minutes. After 5,000 years of tectonic shifts, climate change, and natural erosion, that alignment still functions. Think about what that means. The builders of Newgrange had to understand the exact angle of the sun on the winter solstice. They had to calculate the precise orientation of the passage. They had to engineer the structure to remain stable for millennia. And they had to care enough about marking that one specific moment in the astronomical year that they invested incredible resources into creating a permanent monument to it. Why? Why were ancient people all over the world so obsessed with tracking celestial events? Why build monuments that require sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, geometry, and engineering just to mark solstices and equinoxes? The standard answer is that they needed calendars for agriculture. They had to know when to plant and harvest crops. And there is truth to that. But it does not explain the level of precision we see. It does not explain why they encoded mathematical relationships into their monuments. It does not explain the 432,000-year cycles. Unless they were tracking something bigger than harvest seasons. Unless they were monitoring cosmic cycles that played out over thousands of years. Unless they knew, from bitter experience, that catastrophes arrive on predictable schedules, and the only way to warn future generations was to build monuments so massive and so precisely aligned that they could not be ignored or forgotten. Here's what makes this truly unsettling. These sites are scattered across the planet: Nabta Playa in Africa, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, Stonehenge in England, Newgrange in Ireland, pyramid complexes in Egypt and Central America, temple sites in India and Southeast Asia. They span different continents, different cultures, different languages, different time periods, and yet they share common features: astronomical alignments, megalithic construction, sophisticated mathematical relationships, sexagesimal and base 10 counting systems, obsession with tracking cosmic cycles. The conventional explanation is convergent evolution, that humans everywhere independently developed similar solutions to similar problems. That astronomical observation is a natural human impulse, and monument building is how early societies expressed their understanding of celestial patterns. And maybe that is true. Maybe it is all coincidence. But the mathematics suggests otherwise. When you see the same numbers appearing in sacred texts from Sumeria to India to Scandinavia, when you see the same base 60 system used for measuring time and angles, when you see monuments separated by oceans all encoding relationships to precessional cycles, you start to wonder if there was a common source, a mother culture, a civilization old enough and advanced enough that fragments of its knowledge spread around the world, carried by survivors, preserved by successor cultures who no longer fully understood what they were protecting but knew it was important. That 432,000-year number is a message. It is astronomical data encoded in mythology. It is a calendar meant to survive the collapse of civilizations. It is a warning system built by people who understood that cosmic catastrophes recur, that human societies are fragile, and that knowledge must be preserved in stone and story because everything else eventually burns. Speaking of time and cycles, I am curious, where in the world are you watching this from right now? And what time is it where you are? Maybe you are listening during your morning commute, or maybe it is late at night and you are falling down the rabbit hole of ancient mysteries. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It is fascinating to think about people all over the planet, in different time zones, all connecting over the same questions about our forgotten past. The question is not whether ancient people were capable of this level of sophistication. The evidence proves they were. The question is where they learned it, who taught them, and what happened to the teachers. Because if civilization rose, fell, and rose again, if knowledge was passed down through cataclysms that nearly ended humanity, then the history we have been taught is not just incomplete. It is a fragment of a much longer, much stranger story. And the next chapter of that story is written in ice and stone and the geological scars of a planet that has been reshaped by catastrophe more times than we want to admit. Imagine standing on the coast of India, looking out at the Arabian Sea. The water stretches to the horizon, deep blue and seemingly eternal. Now imagine that same view 20,000 years ago. The coastline would have been 300 miles farther out. Where you see ocean, there would have been forests, rivers, cities perhaps, an entire landscape now drowned beneath hundreds of feet of water. During the last glacial maximum, the period between 26,500 and 19,000 years ago. So much water was locked up in massive ice sheets covering North America, Europe, and Asia that global sea levels dropped by nearly 400 feet. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. The English Channel did not exist. You could walk from France to England. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia by a vast land bridge. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed a single continent called Sahol. And all of that newly exposed land was habitable, fertile, rich with resources. 27 million square kilometers of land that no longer exists. Swallowed by rising seas when the ice melted, if civilizations arose on those coastal plains, if cities were built where rivers met the ancient shorelines, we would never find them. They are gone, buried under 300 feet of ocean and 10,000 years of sediment. But sometimes, divers find things they should not find. Off the coast of Gujarat in western India, in an area called the Gulf of Cambay, sonar surveys in 2001 detected massive geometric structures on the ocean floor. Straight lines, right angles, grid patterns that do not occur naturally. When artifacts were recovered from the site, carbon dating suggested they were 9,500 years old, perhaps older. The discovery was controversial. Some archaeologists dismissed it as natural rock formations misinterpreted by enthusiastic researchers. Others pointed out that the Arabian Sea has been rising for thousands of years, and any coastal settlements from the Ice Age would now be exactly where these structures were found. The Indian government sent multiple expeditions to investigate. They found pottery fragments, construction materials, fossilized wood, and then the funding stopped. The site remains largely unexplored, its secrets still buried in silt. Off the coast of Dwarka, also in Gujarat, underwater surveys have revealed extensive stone structures, walls, and what appear to be building foundations at depths of over 100 feet. According to Hindu texts, Dwarka was the legendary city of Lord Krishna, swallowed by the sea after his death. Mainstream archaeology treated this as pure mythology until divers started finding evidence that a significant settlement had indeed existed there and been submerged. Carbon dating of artifacts recovered from the site ranges from 3,500 to over 9,000 years old. The deeper you go, the older it gets. Then there is Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. A massive underwater structure featuring terraces, ramps, and carved angles that look disturbingly artificial. Discovered in 1986 by a dive tour operator, the Yonaguni monument has sparked decades of debate. Geologist Robert Schock examined the site and concluded that while the base rock is natural, it shows clear evidence of human modification. The terraces are too regular, the angles too precise, the stairways too functional. If it was modified by humans, it would have been done when sea levels were lower, which means 10,000 years ago or more. During a period when Japanese islands were connected to the mainland, and humans were supposedly living in small hunter-gatherer bands with nothing more sophisticated than stone tools and fire. What ties all of these underwater discoveries together is timing. They all date to the end of the last ice age, to a period of catastrophic climate upheaval that reshaped the entire planet in less than 2,000 years. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and it represents one of the most dramatic climate shifts in geological history. Around 12,800 years ago, The Earth was warming. The ice sheets that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years were melting. Sea levels were rising. And then something happened that reversed the warming trend almost overnight. Temperatures plunged. The glaciers stopped retreating and, in some places, began advancing again. This cold snap lasted for roughly 1,200 years before temperatures suddenly shot up again, rising as much as 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade in some regions. 10 degrees in a decade. That is not climate change. That is climate catastrophe. And the evidence for what caused it is literally written in ice. When scientists drill core samples from the Greenland ice sheet, they can read climate history layer by layer, year by year, going back over 100,000 years. In the layers corresponding to 12,800 years ago, they found something extraordinary: a thin black mat containing high concentrations of platinum, iridium, and microscopic diamonds. These are impact markers, the signature of something from space hitting the Earth, not a single massive asteroid, but rather fragments of a disintegrating comet that struck multiple locations across North America, Europe, and possibly other continents. The impacts triggered wildfires that consumed millions of square miles of forest. The smoke and ash blocked out the sun. Temperatures plummeted. And then, as the debris settled and ice dams holding back massive glacial lakes suddenly broke, unimaginable floods reshaped entire continents. One of these floods is called Meltwater Pulse 1A. Around 14,600 years ago, sea levels rose between 50 and 80 feet in less than 500 years. In geological terms, that is instantaneous. Coastal settlements would have been inundated within generations. Everyone living near the ocean would have watched the water creep higher year after year, swallowing beaches, then valleys, then entire regions. Those who survived would have been forced inland, abandoning everything they had built. And this was not an isolated event. The geological record shows multiple periods of rapid sea level rise. Meltwater Pulse 1b occurred around 11,300 years ago, raising sea levels another 30 feet in a matter of centuries. If you were living on the coast during this period, your civilization was doomed, not by war or famine or disease, but by water. Relentless, unstoppable water. This explains something that has puzzled historians for generations. Why do over 200 cultures around the world have flood myths? The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh describes a great deluge that destroys humanity, with only a chosen few surviving on a boat. The biblical story of Noah is nearly identical. Hindu texts describe Manu, warned by a fish god to build a ship before a catastrophic flood. Chinese mythology tells of Gun Yu, who controlled massive floods that threatened to destroy civilization. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon have stories of world-ending waters. For a long time, scholars assumed these were just stories, metaphors perhaps, exaggerated memories of local floods. But what if they are not exaggerations? What if they are accurate descriptions of what happens when ice sheets collapse and sea levels rise dozens of feet in a few generations? What if 200 cultures remember the flood because 200 cultures experienced it? The survivors of these catastrophes would have been traumatized populations, their cities drowned, their populations decimated, their knowledge fragmenting. Some might have fled to higher ground and managed to preserve elements of their culture. Others might have reverted to simpler ways of life, forgetting the sophistication their ancestors possessed. And a few, perhaps, deliberately encoded their knowledge into monuments and myths, hoping that future generations would be smart enough to decode the warnings. This brings us back to a disturbing possibility. What if the advanced astronomical knowledge we see at sites like Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, and Stonehenge was not developed by the people who built those monuments? What if they inherited it? What if they were the survivors or descendants of survivors from coastal civilizations that were destroyed when the ice melted and the seas rose? Göbekli Tepe dates to 9,600 years before the Common Era. That is roughly 11,600 years ago, right in the middle of the Younger Dryas recovery period, right when sea levels were still rising and refugees from drowned coastlines would have been moving inland, searching for safe ground. What if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were not primitive hunter-gatherers suddenly inventing civilization, but rather survivors carrying fragments of older knowledge, trying desperately to preserve what they remembered before it was lost forever? This would explain why they buried the site. They were not abandoning it out of boredom or religious transformation. They were protecting it, creating a time capsule, because they knew that more catastrophes were coming. The 432,000-year cycles encoded in their astronomy told them so. The precession of the equinoxes, the orbital mechanics, the patterns they had tracked for generations or inherited from those who came before, all of it pointed to recurring disasters. Antarctica presents another piece of this puzzle. Today, it is covered by ice sheets over a mile thick in places, but it has not always been frozen. Geological evidence shows that as recently as 6,000 years ago, parts of the Antarctic coast were ice-free. And there is something deeply strange about a map that appeared in 1513. The Piri-Reis map, created by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, shows the coast of South America and, controversially, what appears to be the northern coast of Antarctica. But here is the problem. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, and the coastline on the Piri-Reis map matches what lies beneath the ice. As if whoever made the original source maps, which Piri-Reis claimed to have copied from much older charts, drew Antarctica when it was ice-free. Mainstream historians argue the map shows South America extending farther south than it actually does, and the supposed Antarctic coastline is just artistic error. But Charles Hapgood, a professor of history, argued in the 1960s that the Piri-Reis map was based on ancient source materials created by a civilization with advanced maritime and cartographic knowledge. A civilization that existed before the current Ice Age configuration. Whether you believe Hapgood or not, the question remains, if advanced coastal civilizations existed during the Ice Age, if they mapped continents and oceans, if they built cities that are now underwater, how would we ever know? The ocean is the perfect hiding place for lost history, and we have barely begun to explore it. There is a pillar standing in Delhi, India, that should not exist. It has been standing there for over 1,600 years, exposed to monsoon rains, humidity, and the relentless passage of time. It weighs 6 tons and stands 23 feet tall, and it has never rusted, not once in 16 centuries. Modern metallurgists have studied this pillar extensively, trying to understand how ancient Indian smiths created iron so pure, so resistant to corrosion, that it surpasses many modern techniques. The iron contains trace amounts of phosphorus that create a protective layer, preventing oxidation. But producing that composition requires precise control over smelting temperatures and atmospheric conditions. The technology to create such refined iron supposedly did not exist in the 4th century. Yet there it stands, a testament to knowledge we assume ancient people could not have possessed. The Delhi Iron Pillar is not alone. Around the world, there are artifacts that defy the neat timeline archaeology has constructed. Objects that require technological sophistication their creators were not supposed to have. Precision that should not be achievable with primitive tools. Knowledge that had supposedly not yet been discovered. These are called out-of-place artifacts, and mainstream archaeology has spent decades trying to explain them away, ignore them, or in some cases, actively suppress them. In 1900, sponge divers working off the Greek island of Antikythera discovered a shipwreck dating to approximately 70 years before the Common Era. Among the artifacts recovered was a corroded lump of bronze that would have been unremarkable except that when researchers cleaned it, they found gears. Intricate, precisely cut gears meshed together in a complex mechanism. For decades, the Antikythera mechanism sat in a museum, largely ignored because no one could explain what it was or how it worked. Then, in the 1970s, X-ray imaging revealed the full complexity of the device. It contained at least 30 interlocking bronze gears with triangular teeth cut with remarkable precision. It was an analog computer designed to calculate astronomical positions and predict eclipses decades in advance. The level of mechanical sophistication would not be seen again until medieval European clockmakers began creating astronomical clocks over 1,000 years later. Think about what that means. 2,000 years ago, Greek engineers were creating devices so mechanically advanced that the technology essentially vanished for over a millennium. Why? How does an entire civilization lose the knowledge to build something so sophisticated? Unless that knowledge was rare to begin with, unless only a few people understood it, unless it was held by a specialized class of engineers and astronomers whose traditions were destroyed when the Library of Alexandria burned, when Roman conquests disrupted Greek intellectual centers, when the continuity of knowledge was severed by war and cultural collapse. The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient people were capable of precision engineering we did not think possible, which raises uncomfortable questions about other artifacts that mainstream archaeology dismisses as impossible. In Iraq, archaeologists discovered clay jars dating to around 200 years before the Common Era. These jars contained copper cylinders with iron rods suspended inside. When filled with acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, they generate a small electrical current. They are batteries, primitive by modern standards, but functional. The question is why? What were the Parthians or Babylonians using electricity for? One theory suggests electroplating, coating objects with thin layers of gold or silver through electrical current rather than dangerous mercury amalgams. Experiments have shown that the Baghdad batteries could indeed be used for electroplating, which means people 2,000 years ago may have understood electrical principles that would not be formally discovered until the 1700s. Or consider Pumapunku in Bolivia. This site sits at over 12,000 feet above sea level, on a windswept plain near Lake Titicaca. It is part of a larger complex dating to around 600 years in the Common Era, though some researchers argue elements may be much older. What makes Pumapunku remarkable is not its age but its precision. The stones at Pumapunku are cut with such accuracy that they fit together without mortar, the joints so tight you cannot slide a sheet of paper between them. Many blocks feature complex interlocking shapes, H-blocks with precise angles and channels cut into andesite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on Earth. These are not soft limestone or sandstone. You cannot carve andesite with copper chisels. You need harder materials. Diamond-tipped tools, industrial saws, equipment that did not exist in pre-Columbian South America according to conventional history. Engineers who have examined Pumapunku note that many cuts appear machine-made. The surfaces are flat to within fractions of an inch across spans of several feet. The corners meet at perfect 90-degree angles. The holes drilled into the stone are circular and uniform, as if created by powered drills rather than hand tools. Some blocks show evidence of being cast or molded, as if the stone was somehow softened, shaped, and then hardened again. The conventional explanation is that the ancient builders used harder stones like granite to pound and grind the andesite into shape over many years. That patience and manpower can achieve remarkable precision. And while that may be true for some stone working, it does not explain all of the features at Pumapunku. It does not explain how they achieve such uniformity across hundreds of blocks. It does not explain the complex interlocking joints that would require three-dimensional planning and execution. It does not explain why, if these techniques were so effective, we do not see them replicated at other sites with the same level of precision. Egypt presents similar mysteries. In the desert near Aswan lies an unfinished obelisk, still partially attached to the bedrock it was being carved from. If completed, it would have weighed over 1,200 tons and stood 137 feet tall. It would have been the largest obelisk ever erected, but it cracked during quarrying and was abandoned. The fact that ancient Egyptians even attempted to create a 1,200-ton monolith raises questions about their engineering capabilities. Transporting such a mass, even on the Nile, would require technology and organizational skill that is difficult to reconcile with the Bronze Age tools they supposedly used. But here is what makes it truly strange. The surface of the unfinished obelisk shows parallel striations, marks left by whatever tool was used to cut it. These marks are uniform, evenly spaced, and run in perfectly straight lines across the granite surface. Modern stonemasons who have examined these marks note that they resemble the patterns left by industrial saws or grinding equipment. Hand pounding with stone tools creates irregular pitting and fracturing. It does not create uniform parallel grooves. Yet there they are, visible on a stone that was being quarried 3,000 years ago. Beneath the Serapeum of Saqqara in Egypt, there are 24 enormous granite boxes. Each one weighs between 70 and 100 tons. They are made from Aswan granite, one of the hardest stones in Egypt, transported over 500 miles. The boxes are cut with precision that astounds modern engineers. The internal corners are sharp and square. The surfaces are flat. And when measured with modern instruments, some boxes show internal dimensions accurate to within 2/10,000ths of an inch. 2/10,000ths of an inch. That is the tolerance level of modern precision machinery. That is what you achieve with laser-guided cutting equipment and computer-controlled manufacturing. Yet, these boxes were supposedly created by people using copper chisels and stone pounders. The conventional explanation is that the ancient Egyptians used abrasive sand and copper saws, patiently grinding away at the granite for months or years until they achieved the desired shape. But Christopher Dunn, a precision engineer who has worked with granite in industrial settings, calculated how long it would take to hollow out one of these boxes using Bronze Age technology. His estimate: hundreds of worker years per box. The sheer amount of labor, the quantity of copper tools that would wear out and need replacing, the logistics of managing such a project, all of it seems impractical to the point of absurdity, unless they had better tools, unless they had techniques we do not understand or have not rediscovered. Then there is the Sphinx. For over a century, Egyptologists have dated the Great Sphinx to around 2,500 years before the Common Era, during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. The reasoning is straightforward. The Sphinx sits near Khafre's pyramid. The face might represent Khafre. Therefore, Khafre built it. But in the 1990s, geologist Robert Schoch examined the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure and reached a controversial conclusion. The erosion was caused by water, specifically by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. The problem is that the Egyptian climate has been arid for the past 5,000 years. The Sahara began drying out around 5,000 years before the Common Era. For the Sphinx to show water erosion of the depth and type Schoch observed, it would need to have been carved during a period of significant rainfall, which means it could date to 7,000, 9,000, perhaps even 11,000 years before the Common Era. Egyptologists rejected this conclusion immediately. They argued that Schoch was misinterpreting the geology, that the erosion could be explained by wind and sand, that his dating methodology was flawed, but Schoch is a geologist. Reading stone is what he does professionally, and other geologists who have examined the site have reached similar conclusions. The erosion patterns are consistent with water weathering, not wind abrasion. If the Sphinx is older than the pyramids, if it dates to a time before Egyptian civilization as we understand it existed, then who built it? And why does establishment archaeology resist this possibility so fiercely? Perhaps because accepting an older Sphinx means rewriting the entire timeline of Egyptian history. It means admitting that advanced stone carving and monumental architecture existed in the Nile Valley thousands of years before the pharaohs. It opens the door to questions about pre-dynastic civilizations, lost knowledge, and cultural continuity stretching back into the Ice Age. Careers have been destroyed over questions like these. John Anthony West, who worked with Robert Schoch on the Sphinx research, spent decades being marginalized by academic archaeology. His documentaries were dismissed as pseudoscience. His books were ignored by mainstream publishers. He died in 2018, still advocating for a reassessment of ancient Egyptian chronology, still insisting that the evidence pointed to older, more sophisticated origins than conventional history allowed. This is the pattern with forbidden archaeology. Evidence that does not fit the established narrative is not investigated thoroughly. It is dismissed, explained away with increasingly complex rationales, or simply ignored. Researchers who pursue these lines of inquiry are labeled fringe, their work excluded from peer-reviewed journals, their funding cut. The gatekeepers of academic archaeology have built a fortress around the accepted timeline, and they defend it viciously against anyone who suggests the walls might need to be moved. But the artifacts remain. The Delhi iron pillar stands rust-free. The Antikythera mechanism sits in a museum, its gears still meshed after 2,000 years. The boxes in the Serapeum wait in darkness, their impossible precision unchanged. And the Sphinx stares east toward the rising sun, keeping secrets that mainstream archaeology refuses to hear. Your DNA is a library. Every cell in your body contains a record not just of who you are, but of everyone who came before you. Written in chemical code across 3 billion base pairs is the story of human migration, survival, catastrophe, and mystery. And when scientists began reading that story in detail, they discovered something unsettling. We are not just the descendants of Homo sapiens. We carry genetic fragments from species that should not exist in our family tree. Ghost populations, vanished lineages. DNA from people who were here long before recorded history and then disappeared without explanation. In 2010, scientists analyzing a 40,000-year-old finger bone found in a Siberian cave called Denisova made an announcement that shocked the anthropological world. The bone did not belong to a modern human. It did not belong to a Neanderthal. It belonged to something else entirely, a previously unknown species of hominin that lived alongside both Neanderthals and modern humans. They named it Denisovan, after the cave where it was discovered. But here's what makes Denisovans truly strange. We have found almost no physical remains of them. A finger bone, a few teeth, fragments of skull. That is it. Yet their DNA is everywhere. Melanesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Aboriginal Australians have it. Papuans have it. Tibetans have a specific Denisovan gene variant that allows them to thrive at high altitudes where oxygen is thin. That gene did not come from Neanderthals. It did not evolve independently. It came from interbreeding with a species we know almost nothing about, except that they were sophisticated enough to survive in diverse environments and leave genetic traces across half the planet. And Denisovans are not the only ghost population hiding in our genes. Recent studies have identified DNA sequences in African populations that do not match any known hominin species. Scientists call it archaic admixture, evidence that our ancestors interbred with at least 5 or 6 different hominin species, some of which we have never found physical remains of. They existed, they were human enough that we could produce fertile offspring with them, and then they vanished. This raises a question that anthropologists are uncomfortable discussing. If multiple human species coexisted for hundreds of thousands of years, interbreeding and competing and sharing knowledge, what did those interactions look like? Were Denisovans and Neanderthals building their own civilizations? Did they have language, art, technology, culture? And if they did, would we even recognize it in the archaeological record? We know Neanderthals buried their dead. We know they created art. Cave paintings in Spain, dated to over 64,000 years ago, were made by Neanderthals, not modern humans. They wore jewelry, crafted sophisticated stone tools, and controlled fire. Denisovans, living in Siberia during Ice Age conditions, must have had advanced survival strategies, tailored clothing, and shelters capable of withstanding extreme cold. These were not mindless brutes. They were cognitively complex beings capable of abstract thought. So why did they disappear? Climate change is the usual explanation. Modern humans outcompeted them. Disease? Conflict? But those explanations feel incomplete when you consider the timeline. Neanderthals survived for over 300,000 years across Europe and Asia. They endured multiple ice ages, adapted to diverse environments, and thrived through climate swings that would have destroyed less adaptable species. Then around 40,000 years ago, within a few thousand years, they were gone. That is not slow decline, that is sudden extinction, and it coincides almost exactly with the expansion of modern humans out of Africa and into Eurasia. Either we killed them through direct violence, or we brought diseases they had no immunity to, or something else happened that we do not yet understand, something that eliminated multiple hominin species within a relatively brief window of time. Now consider this. Around 70,000 years ago, the human population crashed. Genetic studies show evidence of a severe bottleneck where the total number of breeding humans dropped to perhaps 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. We almost went extinct. Whatever happened during that period came close to ending our species entirely. The conventional explanation is the Toba supervolcano eruption in Indonesia. Around 74,000 years ago, Toba exploded with a force equivalent to 3,000 times the Mount St. Helens eruption. It ejected 800 cubic miles of ash into the atmosphere, triggering a volcanic winter that may have lasted 6 to 10 years. Temperatures dropped, sunlight dimmed, plants died, animals starved, and humans, already living in small, fragmented populations, were pushed to the edge of survival. But here's the thing. Some populations survived that bottleneck better than others. And when we map genetic diversity today, we find strange patterns that do not quite fit the simple narrative of a volcanic catastrophe followed by slow recovery. Haplogroup X is one of those patterns. This mitochondrial DNA lineage appears in European populations and in certain Native American tribes, particularly in the northeastern United States. But it is absent from East Asian populations. That is a problem because the accepted model of human migration into the Americas involves people crossing the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia around 15,000 years ago. If that is the only route into the Americas, then Native American DNA should closely resemble East Asian DNA, and for the most part, it does, except for haplogroup X. Some researchers have suggested that haplogroup X indicates a separate, much older migration into the Americas, perhaps across the Atlantic during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower, perhaps even before the Bering Migration. This is deeply controversial because it challenges the established timeline and suggests that American prehistory is far more complex than we have assumed. Then there are the Paracas skulls from Peru. Elongated skulls are found in many ancient cultures, usually the result of intentional cranial deformation where infants' heads are bound to alter their shape for aesthetic or cultural reasons. But some of the Paracas skulls are different. They are not just elongated, they have larger cranial volume, different bone structure, unusual suture patterns. In 2014, geneticist Brian Forster arranged for DNA testing on some of these skulls. The mitochondrial DNA results showed haplogroups that do not typically appear in Native American populations. Some samples contain markers more common in Europe and the Middle East. This has led to speculation that the Paracas people had ancestry from outside South America, possibly from migrations we do not yet understand. Mainstream archaeology dismisses these findings as contamination or misinterpretation. The skulls are explained as extreme examples of cranial deformation in individuals with naturally occurring genetic variations. But the fact that controversy exists at all points to how little we actually know about ancient populations and their movements. Another genetic mystery is the Rh-negative blood type. Most humans are H positive, meaning we carry a specific protein on the surface of our red blood cells. This protein is found in all primates, but about 15% of the global population, concentrated heavily in Europe, lacks this protein entirely. They are Rh negative, and no one knows why. The Rh factor is inherited. If both parents are Rh negative, their children will be Rh negative. But here's the strange part. When an Rh negative mother is pregnant with an Rh positive baby, her immune system treats the fetus as a foreign invader and attacks it. Without modern medical intervention, this can cause severe complications or death. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes no sense. Why would a trait that causes reproductive problems persist in the population? Unless Rh-negative blood originally came from a population that was genetically isolated, where everyone was Rh-negative, and the trait only became problematic when those populations mixed with Rh-positive groups. Some researchers have speculated that Rh-negative blood represents remnants of a distinct ancient population, not a different species necessarily, but a long isolated group that developed unique genetic characteristics. Where that group originated and why they were isolated remains unknown. What ties all of these genetic mysteries together is the recurring theme of lost populations, ghost lineages in our DNA, haplogroups that appear where they should not, blood types that suggest ancient isolation and mixing, hominin species that thrived and then vanished. The genetic record tells us that human history is messier, more violent, and more mysterious than the neat migration maps in textbooks suggest. We interbred with species we barely understand. We survived catastrophes that reduced our population to a few thousand individuals scattered across the planet. We carry genetic variants from people who lived in places and times that do not fit the accepted narrative. And periodically, entire lineages disappeared as if someone flipped a switch and erased them from existence. The question is what we are not seeing. If DNA contains fragments of ghost populations, what other ghosts are hiding in the archaeological record? What cities were built by people whose genetic lineage no longer exists? What knowledge did they possess? And when the catastrophes came, when the floods rose and the climate shifted and civilizations collapsed, which groups survived and which were erased so completely that only trace genetic signatures remain? Your ancestors survived the bottleneck 70,000 years ago. They survived the Younger Dryas impact. They survived floods that drowned coastlines and ice ages that buried continents. But not everyone did. Somewhere in your DNA are echoes of the people who did not make it, the ones who built and dreamed and then vanished, leaving only chemical traces in the genomes of strangers. And if we are honest, we have to ask whether we are living in a similar moment. whether our civilization is approaching its own genetic bottleneck, and whether anyone will remember us if we fail to survive it. Knowledge dies when people die. Unless someone writes it down, unless someone teaches it, unless there are institutions dedicated to preserving what previous generations learned through hard experience. And throughout history, certain groups understood this better than others. They created schools that operated in secrecy, teaching students not just facts but entire systems of thought that took decades to master. They called these mystery schools, and what they taught was considered so valuable, so dangerous, that only initiates who had proven themselves worthy were allowed to learn it. The ancient Egyptians perfected this system. For 3,000 years, the temples along the Nile functioned as universities, libraries, and research centers. But you could not simply walk in and demand knowledge. You had to be chosen. You had to undergo years of preliminary training. You had to prove your discipline, your intelligence, your ability to keep secrets. And only then, if you were deemed worthy, would the priests begin teaching you what they really knew. Greek philosophers understood that Egypt held wisdom their own culture lacked. Pythagoras, the mathematician whose theorem you learned in school, spent over 20 years studying in Egyptian temples. He traveled to Memphis and Thebes, was initiated into the priesthood, and learned mathematical and geometric principles that he brought back to Greece and taught to his own students. But even Pythagoras did not teach everything openly. He founded his own mystery school in Croton, where inner circle students learned advanced mathematics and cosmology that outer circle students never heard. Plato made a similar journey. He studied in Egypt for 13 years, absorbing philosophy and geometry from priests who traced their lineage back thousands of years. When he returned to Athens and founded the academy, he structured it along Egyptian lines. Knowledge was hierarchical. Some truths were for everyone, others were reserved for those who had proven they could handle them. What were they protecting? Why the secrecy? One reason was practical. Advanced knowledge gave you power. If you understood astronomy, you could predict eclipses and appear to control the heavens. If you understood medicine, you could heal or poison. If you understood engineering, you could build monuments that would stand for millennia. In a world without intellectual property law, without patents or copyrights, the only way to maintain advantage was to keep your methods secret. But there was another reason. The knowledge itself was dangerous, not in a mystical sense, but in a very practical one. If you taught advanced mathematics to the wrong people, they might use it to wage war more effectively. If you taught metallurgy, they might create weapons. If you taught astronomy and navigation, they might become conquerors. So, the mystery schools filtered their students carefully, ensuring that knowledge was passed only to those who would use it wisely. This system worked for thousands of years. Then it was destroyed. In 48 years before the Common Era, Julius Caesar set fire to ships in Alexandria's harbor during a military engagement. The fire spread to the warehouses on the docks where papyrus scrolls were stored awaiting export, and from there, it may have reached the Great Library itself. We do not know exactly how much was destroyed in that fire or in subsequent burnings and sackings over the following centuries, but estimates suggest the Library of Alexandria held between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its peak. Think about what that represents. 400,000 scrolls in an age when every copy had to be made by hand, when papyrus was expensive, when only knowledge deemed important enough was worth the effort of recording. That collection represented the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Indian, and Babylonian civilizations. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering, philosophy, history, literature, and most of it burned. We know titles of works that were housed in the library because other authors referenced them. We know Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 1700 years before Copernicus because later writers mentioned his work, but Aristarchus's original texts are gone. We know Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy in the 3rd century before the Common Era, but his complete mathematical proofs are lost. We have fragments, references, summaries written by others, but the original knowledge, the complete systems of thought, are gone. India preserved knowledge differently. Rather than centralizing it in libraries, the Vedic tradition relied on oral transmission. Students would spend years memorizing thousands of verses exactly, syllable by syllable, tone by tone. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in existence, was preserved through pure memorization for perhaps 3,000 years before being written down. This method was remarkably effective. When scholars compare different oral lineages of the same Vedic texts, they find almost no variation. The knowledge was preserved with extraordinary fidelity. And what knowledge it was! Vedic mathematics includes concepts like zero, infinity, negative numbers, and binary systems that would not appear in European mathematics until over 1,000 years later. Indian astronomers calculated planetary movements, eclipse cycles, and the precession of the equinoxes with precision that rivaled or exceeded anything achieved in Greece or Babylon. They developed advanced surgical techniques, understood circulation and anatomy, and created pharmaceutical compounds that are still used today. But like Egypt, India's knowledge traditions were disrupted by conquest and cultural upheaval. When Islamic armies swept through northern India in the medieval period, universities like Nalanda and Taxila were destroyed. Nalanda, which had operated for over 700 years and educated 10,000 students at its peak, was burned in 1193. The library reportedly burned for 3 months. Monks fled with whatever texts they could carry. Much of the rest was lost. The Maya in Central America developed one of the most sophisticated astronomical systems in the ancient world. Without telescopes, they calculated the Venus cycle to an accuracy of 99.92%. They tracked Mars, Jupiter, and Mercury. They understood that solar years did not divide evenly into whole days and created correction factors to keep their calendar aligned with the actual motion of the Earth around the Sun. They built observatories and aligned their temples to track solstices, equinoxes, and planetary conjunctions. All of this knowledge was recorded in codices, bark paper books covered in hieroglyphic writing. Thousands of these books existed when Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century. Today, exactly 4 survive. 4. The rest were burned by Catholic priests who believed Mayan knowledge was demonic. Bishop Diego de Landa personally oversaw the burning of hundreds of codices in a single auto da fe in 1562. Decades later, he wrote a book trying to explain Mayan culture, ironically becoming one of our primary sources for a civilization he helped destroy. We will never know what was in those books. We will never know how the Maya achieved their astronomical precision. We can reverse engineer their mathematics by analyzing the surviving codices and the inscriptions on monuments. But the full system, the pedagogical texts that explained how they taught students, the deeper theories behind their observations, all of that is gone. The Inca used a different system entirely. They recorded information using quipu, knotted strings that encoded numerical and possibly linguistic data. A trained quipu kamayak could read these strings the way we read books, extracting complex information about populations, tribute, resources, and history. When Spanish forces conquered the Inca Empire, they systematically destroyed quipu, viewing them as pagan records. Priests burned them by the thousands. Today we have about 600 quipu surviving in museums. We can decode the numerical information because the knot system is straightforward. But we cannot read the linguistic or historical content because the key to that system died with the quipu kamayokes. We have books in a language we cannot read, recording history and knowledge we can never recover. This pattern repeats everywhere you look. Knowledge preserved by specialized groups, transmitted through careful training, encoded in formats that require initiation to understand. And then conquest, fire, religious zealotry, or simple cultural collapse, erasing the teachers and leaving the rest of us illiterate in the face of our own heritage. Which brings us to a disturbing modern parallel. There are still mystery schools operating today, not in temples or secret societies, but in specialized academic departments and research institutions. Knowledge that took generations to develop, that requires years of training to understand, held by relatively small numbers of experts. If those experts were suddenly gone, if universities were destroyed, if the hard drives and servers and cloud backups all failed simultaneously, how much would we lose? More importantly, how much have we already lost without knowing it? The Baghdad House of Wisdom was destroyed by Mongol invasion in 1258. Books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water reportedly turned black from ink. What scientific advances, what mathematical proofs, what astronomical observations were in those texts? We will never know. The question the mystery schools were trying to answer was this: how do you preserve knowledge across catastrophes? How do you ensure that what one generation learns is not lost when cities burn, when empires fall, when climate shifts and populations collapse? Their answer was to encode it in monuments, in myths, in mathematical relationships so elegant they would be rediscovered even if the original context was forgotten. To initiate classes whose entire purpose was preservation and transmission. To hide the most important knowledge in plain sight, disguised as religion or art or architecture, waiting for someone clever enough to decode it. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly what we have been doing in this documentary. Looking at the monuments they left, the numbers they preserved, the stories they encoded, and asking whether they were trying to tell us something. Whether the 432,000-year cycles, the astronomical alignments, the impossible precision of ancient engineering, were all breadcrumbs left by people who knew civilizations fall and wanted desperately for someone in the future to understand what they had learned. Before we have to learn it all again the hard way. Science is supposed to be about following evidence wherever it leads, about testing hypotheses, challenging assumptions, and revising theories when new data emerges. That is the ideal. But science is done by humans, and humans build careers, protect reputations, and defend territories. When evidence threatens the foundational narratives that entire academic fields are built upon, something interesting happens. The evidence gets ignored. The researchers presenting it get marginalized, and the institutions that control funding, publication, and tenure close ranks to protect the orthodoxy. This is not conspiracy. This is how paradigms work. Thomas Kuhn explained it in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Normal science operates within an accepted framework. Researchers solve puzzles within that framework, but occasionally, anomalies accumulate, data that does not fit, observations that cannot be explained, and eventually, enough pressure builds that the paradigm shifts, but that shift never happens smoothly. The old guard fights it every step of the way, because accepting the new paradigm means admitting they were wrong, that their careers were built on incomplete or incorrect assumptions, that the papers they published, the grants they awarded, the students they trained, were all working within a flawed model. In archaeology, the paradigm is clear. Civilization began in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago. Agriculture developed independently in a few locations over the past 10,000 years. Before that, humans were hunter-gatherers with no complex social organization or monumental architecture. This timeline is taught in every university. It is written in every textbook. It is the foundation upon which academic reputations are built. And then someone like Robert Schoch comes along. Schoch is not an amateur enthusiast with fringe theories. He is a geologist with a PhD from Yale, a professor at Boston University, an expert in rock weathering and erosion patterns. When he examined the Sphinx in Egypt and concluded that the weathering was caused by water, not wind, he was applying his professional expertise to a geological question. His conclusion, that the Sphinx is thousands of years older than Egyptologists claim, follows directly from the evidence. The response from establishment archaeology was immediate and vicious. Egyptologists, most of whom have no training in geology, declared Schoch wrong. They published papers arguing that he had misinterpreted the erosion. They organized conferences specifically to debunk his work. They ensured that his research was excluded from major archaeological journals. And most effectively, they damaged his reputation to the point where other researchers became cautious about working with him, fearful that association would taint their own careers. John Anthony West, who brought Schoch to Egypt and collaborated on the Sphinx research, faced even harsher treatment. West was not an academic. He was an independent researcher, which made him an easier target. His documentaries were dismissed as pseudoscience. His books were published by alternative presses because mainstream academic publishers would not touch them. He spent the last decades of his life trying to get establishment archaeology to seriously engage with the water erosion evidence. They never did. They simply waited for him to die, which he did in 2018. and then continued as if his work had never existed. This is the pattern. Challenge the timeline, lose your funding. Suggest that civilization is older than accepted, lose your tenure. Publish in alternative venues because mainstream journals reject your work, then get accused of avoiding peer review. It is a perfect trap. The gatekeepers control every avenue of legitimacy, and they use that control to protect the paradigm. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a perfect example of how this process works. In 2007, a team of researchers proposed that a comet impact triggered the sudden climate shift 12,800 years ago. They presented evidence of impact markers in sediment layers, including nanodiamonds, platinum anomalies, and magnetic spherules. They showed that these markers appeared at dozens of sites across North America and Europe, all dating to the same narrow time window. The response from the geological establishment was swift rejection. Papers were published claiming the impact markers were misidentified, that they could be explained by other processes, that the dating was unreliable. Grant applications to fund further research were denied. Scientists who supported the hypothesis found their work excluded from major conferences. For over a decade, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis was treated as fringe science, something only amateurs and cranks would take seriously. Then, more evidence accumulated. Independent teams confirmed the platinum anomaly. The nanodiamonds were verified. Impact craters dating to the correct period were identified. Slowly, grudgingly, mainstream geology began to admit that maybe there was something to the hypothesis after all. But notice the timeline. It took over 10 years of persistent research, repeated confirmation, and generational turnover in the field before the idea gained tentative acceptance. And during those 10 years, how many careers were damaged? How many researchers abandoned the topic because continuing meant professional suicide? Now, imagine what happens when the evidence is not just challenging a detail of the timeline but threatening to overturn the entire narrative. When it suggests that advanced civilizations existed before the accepted start of history, that knowledge was lost and rediscovered multiple times. That the story we tell about human progress from primitive to advanced is wrong. The Bosnian pyramid controversy illustrates this perfectly. In 2005, Bosnian researcher Semir Osmanagic claimed that a hill near Visoko was actually an ancient pyramid covered by soil and vegetation. He organized excavations that uncovered massive stone blocks, tunnels, and what appeared to be concrete-like construction materials. Carbon dating of organic material found in the concrete suggested it was over 25,000 years old. The archaeological establishment responded with fury. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a formal condemnation, calling the project a hoax and demanding that the Bosnian government shut down the excavation. They organized petitions signed by hundreds of archaeologists, none of whom had visited the site, all declaring that the pyramid claim was pseudoscience. Major media outlets ran stories ridiculing Osmanagic and his team. But here is the problem. Tourists can visit the site. They can walk through the tunnels. They can see the stone blocks. They can examine the material samples. Whether or not it is actually a pyramid, there is clearly something artificial there, something constructed, something that deserves investigation by qualified geologists and archaeologists. Instead, the establishment declared it off-limits, not through investigation and evidence, but through institutional authority. Why? Because if the Visoko site is even partially artificial, if humans were constructing megalithic structures in the Balkans 25,000 years ago during the last ice age, then every timeline needs to be revised. Every narrative about the development of European civilization becomes suspect, and that is too threatening to accept without overwhelming evidence. So the safer strategy is to declare it impossible, refuse to investigate properly, and marginalize anyone who disagrees. The Smithsonian Institution has faced persistent allegations of artifact suppression for over a century. Newspaper accounts from the 1800s and early 1900s contain dozens of reports of giant skeletons being discovered in burial mounds across North America. 7 feet tall, 8 feet tall, some reports claim even larger. These skeletons were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian for analysis and then disappeared. When researchers have requested access to these specimens in recent decades, the Smithsonian claims no records exist. The artifacts are lost, if they ever existed at all. Are the giant skeleton reports real? probably some are exaggerations or misidentifications. 19th century newspapers were not known for rigorous fact-checking, but all of them? Every single report from dozens of different locations over multiple decades? That seems unlikely. More probable is that some reports were legitimate, that unusual skeletal remains were found, and that they were either lost through bureaucratic incompetence or deliberately suppressed because they did not fit the accepted narrative about pre-Columbian American populations. Religious institutions have their own reasons for suppressing certain narratives. Young Earth creationism, the belief that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, requires rejecting virtually all evidence of ancient civilizations, ice ages, and evolutionary history. Any archaeological site older than 4,000 years becomes theologically problematic. So, creationist organizations fund research designed to debunk radiometric dating, dismiss geological evidence, and reinterpret the fossil record to fit a biblical timeline. This creates an odd situation where establishment archaeology spends as much time fighting creationists as it does investigating actual anomalies. The result is that any research challenging conventional timelines gets lumped in with creationism and dismissed without examination. Suggest the Sphinx is older than 4,500 years, and you are accused of supporting pseudoscience. Never mind that you are proposing it is 9,000 years old, not 6,000. The nuance is lost. You are either with the orthodox timeline or you are a creationist. There is no middle ground. Colonial powers perfected the art of erasing history. Spanish conquistadors burned Mayan codices to destroy pagan knowledge. British archaeologists in the 19th century shipped Egyptian artifacts back to London museums, stripping context and dismantling sites. Chinese authorities during the Cultural Revolution destroyed countless historical monuments, viewing them as symbols of the feudal past. And in every case, the official narrative was that they were protecting civilization, spreading enlightenment, or building a better future. The fact that they were erasing evidence of sophisticated pre-colonial cultures was just collateral damage. Even today, Göbekli Tepe, perhaps the most important archaeological site discovered in the past 50 years, has been only 5% excavated after over 25 years of work. Why so slow? Funding is always the official answer, but other sites with less revolutionary implications seem to have no trouble securing resources. It is hard not to wonder if the slow pace is deliberate, if revealing too much too quickly would force uncomfortable revisions to the historical narrative, so the site is revealed gradually, allowing the establishment time to adjust, to incorporate new findings into existing frameworks without triggering paradigm collapse. The truth is that history has always been written by winners, not just in terms of military conquest, but in terms of institutional power. Those who control universities control what is taught. Those who control journals control what is published. Those who control funding control what is researched. And those who control the narrative control what the public believes about the past. Challenging that narrative requires not just evidence, but courage. The willingness to sacrifice career advancement, to endure ridicule, to work without institutional support. Most researchers are not willing to make that sacrifice. And so the orthodoxy persists, not because the evidence supports it, but because the incentive structures of academia punish anyone brave enough to question it. We have spent this entire documentary looking backward, at monuments buried under jungles and deserts, at numbers carved into clay tablets, at genetic ghosts and suppressed evidence. But none of it matters unless we ask the most important question. What does this mean for us, for our civilization, for the people living right now who assume that progress is linear, that technology only advances, that the world we have built is permanent? Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Every piece of evidence we have examined suggests that civilization is not permanent, that knowledge can be lost, that advanced societies can collapse so completely that their survivors forget they ever existed, and that this has happened before. Multiple times. The 432,000-year cycles encoded in ancient texts are not mythology. They are a warning system, a message left by people who understood that catastrophe recurs on predictable timescales and wanted desperately for future generations to be prepared. The pattern is clear once you see it. Approximately every 12,000 to 13,000 years, the Earth experiences dramatic climate shifts. The Younger Dryas event 12,800 years ago, The end of the African humid period 5,000 years ago, which turned the Sahara from grassland to desert within a few generations. The Bronze Age collapsed 3,200 years ago, which destroyed nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean simultaneously. And before that, cycles stretching back into the Ice Ages, each one reshaping coastlines, destroying ecosystems, and forcing human populations to either adapt or die. What causes these cycles? The Younger Dryas was likely triggered by a comet impact. But not all catastrophes require external triggers. The Earth itself goes through periodic changes. The magnetic field, which protects us from solar radiation, weakens and strengthens in cycles. Right now, it is weakening. Since the 1840s, Earth's magnetic field has declined by approximately 9%, and that decline is accelerating. The North Magnetic Pole is moving faster than at any point in recorded history, drifting from Canada towards Siberia at over 30 miles per year. If the magnetic field continues weakening, we could be approaching a pole reversal. The last one happened 780,000 years ago. During a reversal, the field does not disappear entirely, but it becomes chaotic. Multiple poles appear. The protective shield against cosmic radiation becomes patchy and unpredictable, and that has consequences. Increased radiation reaching the surface, damage to electronics, disruption to animal migration patterns that rely on magnetic navigation, possible impacts on human health that we do not yet understand because it has been nearly 1,000,000 years since the last reversal, and we were not exactly taking notes at the time. Some researchers, including Ben Davidson, who runs the Suspicious Observers channel, have proposed something even more dramatic: the solar micronova hypothesis. The idea is that our sun goes through periodic outburst cycles every 12,000 years or so, ejecting massive amounts of plasma that interact catastrophically with Earth's weakened magnetic field. This would cause sudden climate shifts, electromagnetic pulses that destroy technology, and extinction-level events for unprepared civilizations. Is the solar micronova hypothesis proven? No. It remains controversial and speculative, but it is based on observations of other stars that do exhibit this behavior, on ice core data showing regular climate catastrophes, and on patterns in the geological record that suggest something dramatic happens on these timescales. Whether the mechanism is solar outbursts, comet impacts, magnetic reversals, or some combination, the pattern of cyclical catastrophe is undeniable. And here is what should terrify you. Our civilization is uniquely vulnerable. We are dependent on infrastructure that would not survive even a minor electromagnetic pulse. The power grid, the internet, GPS satellites, financial systems, supply chains, all of it runs on electronics that are sensitive to electromagnetic interference. A Carrington event-level solar flare, like the one that hit Earth in 1859, would be inconvenient in the 19th century. It would be civilization ending today. In 1859, telegraph systems across North America and Europe sparked and caught fire. Operators received electric shocks. Some systems continued working even after being disconnected from their power supplies, energized purely by the induced currents from the geomagnetic storm. That event lasted a few days and then passed. If it happened now, it would destroy transformers across entire continents. Power grids would collapse. And because modern transformers take months to manufacture and require a functioning industrial base to produce, we would not be able to rebuild quickly. We would be looking at years without electricity across large portions of the planet. No electricity means no refrigeration, no water pumping, no fuel distribution. Cities would become uninhabitable within weeks. Millions would die from starvation, dehydration, and disease in the first year alone. And that is from a solar event we know is possible because it has happened before in recorded history. Imagine something worse: an impact event, a magnetic reversal, a solar micronova. Any of these would reduce modern civilization to scattered survivors within a generation. This is what the ancient texts are warning us about. The Sumerian King List, with its 432,000-year cycles, is not recording when kings ruled. It is recording how long it takes for civilization to rise, peak, and collapse before the next catastrophe resets everything. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa are not religious monuments. They are calendars, warning systems, built by survivors of previous collapses who wanted future generations to understand the pattern. So what do we do with this knowledge? First, we need to take preservation seriously. Not just digital backups, which are useless without functioning computers and power grids, but physical archives, libraries printed on durable materials, seeds stored in vaults like Svalbard, knowledge encoded in formats that could be decoded by survivors with 19th century technology or less. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway is one example of doing this right. Built into a mountain on an Arctic island, it stores duplicate samples of seeds from crop collections around the world. If a catastrophe destroys agricultural diversity, if climate change or war or pandemic wipes out food crops, the vault provides a backup. It is designed to survive even without power, using the natural cold of the Arctic to keep seeds frozen for centuries. We need similar vaults for knowledge. Not Wikipedia on hard drives, but essential information printed on acid-free paper, stored in geologically stable locations, designed to survive whatever comes next. How to purify water, how to make antibiotics, how to smelt metal, how to generate electricity, basic mathematics and science, agricultural techniques, all the knowledge that someone rebuilding civilization would need to avoid spending 10,000 years rediscovering what we already know. Second, we need to pay attention to what ancient civilizations tried to tell us. The astronomical alignments are not decorative. They are showing us which celestial events to track. The 432,000-year number is not mystical. It is encoding precessional cycles that take thousands of years to observe but have predictable consequences. The flood myths are not metaphors. They are cultural memories of what happens when ice sheets collapse and sea levels rise dozens of feet within a few generations. If those warnings are accurate, if we are approaching another cyclical catastrophe, then the question is not whether it will happen, but whether we can survive it. Ancient civilizations survived through dispersion. Small populations spread across diverse environments. If one region flooded, others remained habitable. If one climate zone became uninhabitable, people migrated. But our civilization is doing the opposite. We are concentrating in vulnerable coastal cities, building infrastructure that requires global supply chains, creating technological systems with single points of failure that cascade into total collapse. In some ways, we are more fragile than hunter-gatherers. If you destroy the modern food distribution system, most people do not know how to grow crops or hunt game. If you eliminate electricity, most people do not know how to preserve food without refrigeration or communicate without phones. We have traded resilience for efficiency, and that trade works wonderfully during stable periods. But stability never lasts. Third, we need to ask what else has been suppressed or ignored. If establishment archaeology has spent a century dismissing evidence of older civilizations, what else are they missing? If genetic studies show ghost populations we never suspected existed, what other blind spots do we have in our understanding of the past? The purpose of studying ancient catastrophes is not to indulge in doom prophecy. It is to learn from the only laboratory experiment we have access to. Previous civilizations that faced similar challenges. Some adapted and survived. Others collapsed entirely. Understanding which strategies worked and which failed could be the difference between our civilization joining the survivors or becoming another forgotten layer in the archaeological record. And finally, we need humility. The belief that we are the pinnacle of human achievement, that no previous civilization could have matched our sophistication, is not just arrogant, it is dangerous. It makes us blind to lessons written in stone and encoded in myths. It makes us dismissive of warnings that previous survivors left for us, and it makes us unprepared for events that have happened repeatedly throughout human history. The monuments are still there. Göbekli Tepe sits in the Turkish highlands, 95% still buried, waiting to reveal more secrets. The Sphinx stares east, its water-worn stone recording climate conditions from thousands of years before the pharaohs. The Sumerian King List remains in museums, its 432,000-year cycles still unexplained by mainstream scholarship. And around the world, underwater sites hint at civilizations we never looked for because we assumed they could not exist. We have been given a gift. Previous civilizations preserved their knowledge through catastrophes, specifically so that we might learn from their experience. They built in stone because stone survives. They encoded in mathematics because mathematics is universal. They aligned with astronomy because the stars do not lie. And they repeated their warnings in myth and monument and sacred text because they knew that civilizations forget, but patterns recur. The question is whether we are wise enough to listen, whether we can overcome institutional inertia, academic gatekeeping, and comfortable assumptions to seriously examine what our ancestors tried to teach us. Because the next catastrophe is not a question of if, but when, and when it comes, the only things that will survive are the preparations we make now and the knowledge we preserve in formats that outlast digital storage and fragile infrastructure. Our civilization has maybe a few decades to get this right, to build the archives, to decode the warnings, to prepare for the possibility that everything we take for granted could disappear within a generation. The ancient survivors did their part. They left us maps, numbers, monuments, and myths. They pointed us toward the patterns that matter. Now it is our turn. We can ignore the warnings and hope that this time will be different. Or we can accept that we are not special, that the cycles that destroyed previous civilizations will eventually come for ours, and that our responsibility is not just to ourselves but to whoever comes after. To leave them something better than scattered ruins and forgotten languages. To preserve what we have learned so that humanity does not have to start from zero again. The choice is ours, but the clock is ticking, and the stars, indifferent and eternal, continue their slow wheel through patterns our ancestors understood better than we do. The evidence we have shown you today is just the beginning. There are more sites, more artifacts, more suppressed discoveries that tell an even stranger story. If you want to see what we found next, the journey continues right here on Tales Before Tesla, because some truths refuse to stay buried.